through the marketing within the education sector. We're going to be going through the ability to reduce risk as much as possible, so that we could be looking at how you'd be planning with data rather with an instinct. In the bottom right-hand corner, you should have the ability to ask any questions. So feel free to ask questions as we go along. I will then either come back to you after the session, or I will stop what I'm presenting and I will go through the question there. If you feel like you get to the end of the session and you've still got some questions, there'll be plenty of time to ask them at the end. And we'll also send a recording out afterwards. So feel free to come back to that email if you have a particular question about anything we've covered. So the topics that we're going to be looking at are the current landscape within education marketing, what risk within media actually means, and potentially why it's increasing at the moment. We will have a look at some of the historic approaches, some of which are based on instinct. We'll talk about how that's kind of impacting budgets. We will talk through what using data to plan your media actually looks like in real life, so some practical tips around that. And we'll talk about how you could use some demand and performance data to guide the investment for this year, and how you could be perhaps reducing some of the risk that you have within your current schedules around the channels that you selected, the audience that you're targeting, but also some of the timing elements that you might have in there. And then from that, we can move into discussing smarter budget allocation, given that there's so much uncertainty in the marketplace at the moment, and where testing and measurement can be used in terms of risk reduction tools. Again, some of those things will be very practical that you should be able to apply to your current strategy. Finally, we will get to what this is all going to mean for education brands today and in the near future. And we will then have the opportunity for any questions at the end, or to go over any topics you feel like you need a bit more detail on. So at the moment, as you will all be aware, education marketing budgets are under very intense scrutiny, probably the most scrutiny that they have ever had in the past. As with all budgets across the sector, there's a need to be getting a measurable return on investment. There's a need to be tracking why you are using certain channels and certain platforms rather than other platforms. And there is a lot of volatility in terms of demographics, geopolitical influences, visa policies, and affordability within the UK, but also for some of the international schools. That also, coupled with the fact that media costs are rising and the attention of your target audience is fragmenting quite significantly at the moment, does create somewhat of a perfect storm in terms of some of the challenges you're likely to be facing at the moment. The reason this is particularly difficult for the education sector is because previously it was quite stable. So what worked in previous years and in previous periods of time was quite a good indicator of what would be working for the next upcoming year. But sadly, that's no longer a strategy that is working. So there's a need to be more agile in your approach. A lot of people are cutting budgets at the moment or holding budgets. We know that that isn't the risky part. That spending less part isn't the bit that people should be focusing on. It's actually kind of spending blind. So it's not necessarily about trying to kind of cut out things. It's about focusing on the right areas to make sure that you are confident in your decisions and that you're actually getting the results that you need. So a lot of people talk about media risk, and it can become a bit of a buzz phrase, but there's three core areas to what it actually really means. So there's the risks around the channels that you're selecting, so potentially over-reliance on one particular platform or one particular tactic because you've seen that it worked or it gets significantly better conversion rate, for example, than other channels. So that platform is reused. Whereas actually having a diverse mix of channels is of benefit, especially in a time where people are kind of bombarded on certain platforms with marketing. It's important that they're seeing your messaging across different places, and it's a little bit more subtle than it once was. There's the audience risk. So you're assuming that people are going to be behaving in a certain way, and you're not actually basing it on the behavior of that audience and how they're currently engaging with content. And then finally, there's timing risk. I think that it's quite difficult to constantly be considering the decision windows that you have, because traditionally they have been very stable. But do keep an eye on your data. Make sure that you're focusing brand awareness and lead generation or inquiry generation at the right times of the year based on your data and what you're seeing happening in the marketplace. So the area that we often see as kind of being a little bit misunderstood in terms of media risk is people potentially optimizing on the wrong metrics. So it's very easy to get some of that data towards the top of the funnel, and it's harder to see the data further down the funnel in terms of true conversion. So you might be basing it solely on website visitors, but it is important that you are optimizing based on conversions and hopefully registrations and admissions at the end of the funnel. In terms of why sometimes this approach isn't taken for smaller organizations, smaller schools, smaller businesses, that experience-led, that instinct-led approach to selecting your targeting, the channels that you're using, the timing that you're going live with campaigns, it previously did work for some people. So I think there's still a bit of a hangover from that period of time. But it doesn't mean that those instincts based on that experience are correct any longer. So there are kind of changes taking place in the marketplace that are faster than kind of that memory and that data can kind of keep up with when it's historic. So past success is creating in certain places false confidence in channels, false confidence in targeting, and that can lead to bias in terms of the channels that should be used. And there is quite often internal politics that a lot of people don't really talk about, but a fear from perhaps SLT that they're missing out on particular channels because other people are on those platforms. So that can amplify that risk because you're selecting based on other people's opinions or other people are doing your channels, your timing, and your audience. Data is improving all the time. So that is the one good point here after listing a long list of things that are problems. So data is going to be able to help you better tell where the demand is now, whereas that experience was kind of saying what was working 6 months ago or 12 months ago or even 18 months ago. So in terms of what does this all mean in practical terms, what does it mean when you're trying to implement some of these things that you can learn from? So it means that you should be using evidence to reduce that uncertainty at each of the different decision points. So are you going to be moving budget from one campaign to another, for example, and not just reporting after the fact? Because in many situations, that's going to be too late for you to adjust your approach. So where you're driving those planning decisions based on that data, it will help you to understand who you're targeting, where to invest, when you're going to be using that spend, how much you're going to have your budget to allocate. But importantly, and the most important part at the bottom is around which areas should you be testing and which areas are working well enough and are actually going to be able to scale. So understanding that data working with your marketing agency, working with the media partners that you have, is going to be really important to see which bits should you continue testing, which bits should you start testing, but also which bits are scalable and which bits are just doing well, but they are very well optimized. So one of the things that you can do to kind of keep this approach simple is to use these 3 different areas to reduce your media risk. It doesn't have to be overly complicated. So you could be looking at demand data, the audience behavior data, and also media performance data. So for the demand data, you'd be looking at some of the search trends. You'd be looking at things like the course and the subject trends that are out there. So what signals are out there in terms of your audience, what are people searching for, what are people engaging with. And you could also be looking at some of those geographic demand shifts. So are there areas that you're targeting that no longer are appropriate in terms of the demographics? And are there potentially new areas that could be working really well for you? So as with most of the country, there are quite often areas that are new builds. They're quite often areas that do have a lack of educational services. So you could be doing some research to get some of the data around that. So you could be targeting the appropriate areas and just making sure that you're really focused on what you should be. In terms of audience behavior, you could be looking at the funnel. So where are people dropping off? Who are those people that are dropping off at the different stages, and why are they dropping off at that stage? What could be the reasons for it? And are there any commonalities between people dropping out, say, early on in the process, or the middle of the process, or the end of the process, so that you could adjust your approach? So if you're attracting and converting lots of a certain demographic in terms of the form conversions, do those people actually turn out to be registered at the end of the process? And if not, could they be somebody that you're removing from that audience targeting at the beginning of the funnel? And then finally, it's about looking kind of at the cost versus the quality of those outcomes through that performance data. Are there any signals that as you've grown spend, or you've grown the length of time that campaigns are running on certain channels, that you're starting to saturate that market? And is there anything that you can do to build up kind of marginal returns in terms of you don't have to suddenly double the performance of something? Is there something that you could be building on in terms of increasing spend, or increasing the target audience, or shrinking the target audience to get better performance from particular channels? So in terms of how that would look in reality, there would be a shift from guesswork for some of the channels to having kind of guardrails that would help you focus and target your spend in particular areas. So rather than having fixed channel splits, you could have more of a dynamic budget allocation. You could be moving away from focusing on last year's winners to focusing on solely on kind of the current demand signals that you can get access to. You could be moving away from counting clicks as success, so clicking through to content or clicking through to forms, for example, to actually looking at enrollment and end of funnel conversions. And you could be moving away from optimizing your approach, your audience, your targeting from kind of reactive, so to what's kind of been working over the last month, to predictive, based on what you're seeing is happening in the marketplace and what you're seeing happening in some of those signals that are out there about, say, particular subjects or particular keywords that people are focused on at that point in time. So there's a lot to unpick there in terms of where we would recommend that you perhaps started to save the most money. We see the kind of the high impact areas as reducing investment in saturated channels. So where some of that spend on top of what you were doing previously is actually just going into an oversaturated channel, and therefore it's not getting the same return on investment. Some of that budget can be cut down. Identifying underpriced demand pockets. So trying to kind of keep on top of that intent data, trying to keep on top of some of those trends, finding out from senior leadership what kind of conversations are being had, finding out from some of the tours and the open days, what areas of demand and intent are there. By doing that, you're going to be able to find out that there are a number of areas that are perhaps underpriced in terms of nobody else is targeting them. So therefore, you can get an exceptionally good return on investment. You could be shifting some of the spend to earlier or later in the decision cycle to see the impact that that has. So testing some of those things is really important, and not just taking it based on previous years, but actually adjusting and shifting to see what impact that has. And knowing what not to fund is really important. So if there are areas that you're unsure about and you can't kind of prove them, and they're not actually coming up in conversations or in open days or conversations with customers and parents and sixth form pupils, making sure that you rule those out and actually stick to that is really important, and it's actually harder to do than it sounds. So testing is something that is always a difficult area to do. So people often talk about kind of having small structured tests to reduce down the risk of wasting money. You do also have the issue that on a number of channels, small budgets aren't going to get you many results. It's going to underperform. So making sure that you're picking the right budget for a test size, potentially having less tests and a little bit more money behind some of those budgets are going to be better decisions. So using that data that you will have access to decide on kind of test size. What does success mean for you in terms of that spend? And what are you going to use as stop points? So if you get a week in or 2 weeks in and you're not reaching X, Y, and Z, are they going to be things that you're going to use to determine whether you're going to stop the campaigns or not? It's very difficult when you're kind of working with people who aren't necessarily in marketing to be able to kind of get this across as an asset, as in you've tried this, it didn't work, and this is what you've learned from it, rather than a failure. So to a certain degree, there is also an element of explaining to people that maybe are involved in the budget setting, that it isn't a failure when you kind of reach some of these points and they haven't worked, because if you're not testing things, you're never going to be improving on your approach. So the best way to do that would be to point out that the riskiest strategy here is not testing at all. So some of those things around like website visitors, for example, they can be a bit of kind of a vanity metric in terms of the data that you're getting from places like Meta and some of those other platforms. Again, it can be interesting rather than useful sometimes. So it's important to move away from some of those figures and start to move on to focusing on, say, outcome aligned KPIs. Some of those enrollment and admissions data sets that you'll have, and trying to kind of clean those up and linking them back to your marketing data. And then when you're having that planning stage, looking at as many data points as possible, getting support, doing some research on how can you have very clear confidence in the ranges that you have. So when you're predicting the outcome that you're going to have for a campaign, it should be based also on what do you count as success for that level of spend. So that going back to the previous slide, you can understand when to scale something and when to put a stop to something as well. So what does this mean for the education sector as a whole? I think that we've definitely seen there's an increased risk in media at the moment, but it is manageable. There are things that you can do. The data is improving, which is going to be vital to success. I think sometimes it can be more stressful because it feels like as that access to data and the ability to get data is still quite difficult, but it is available. There's always that kind of fear that you're missing out on something. So do ask for some help if you need it. And there is a requirement now for many educational organisations to be basing everything on data, having very clear KPIs, tracking what success looks like, tracking what failure looks like, and working with people like ourselves to reduce that risk and not just kind of manage the process of buying channels or access to channels at set periods of time in the year. It's not always going to be possible to get certainty in terms of how something is going to perform, or even your ability to track results and get data. But it is possible to feel significantly more confident in your decisions and significantly more confident that you'll put a stop to something or you'll scale something where it is appropriate. So they were all of the different topics that we were going to today. I'm just going to go back to the agenda. I'm going to stop the recording, but please feel free to add any questions that you have in the